Hey guys, welcome back to the Pre-Calculus 20 videos. In this video, we're going to look at lesson 4 from chapter 4, which is talking about the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is another way that we can find the roots of an equation. It can be a good method to use if you guys like to work with one formula and you don't have to manipulate any other equations. And it's also a good method to use if you can't use factoring or completing the square and you really don't want to graph. So the quadratic formula states that x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. So if this just looks like a bunch of mumbo jumbo, that's fine. We'll do some practice and life will be great. But this a, b, and c really comes from those coefficients from your standard form of the quadratic equation. So here you have ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So a, b, and c are just those numbers that are in front of the variables, or that c value that stands alone. One other thing that we'll make a note of just before we move on to an example is this under your square root symbol, or that radical, that there is called your discriminant. And it's actually really important because say if I were to ask you to find just the number of solutions, so not the solutions themselves, but just how many of them there are, the discriminant can tell you exactly how many solutions a quadratic equation will have. So if your discriminant, so you take b squared minus 4ac, if that value is positive, that means you're going to have two solutions, or two roots. If it's 0, that means you're going to have one solution. And if it's negative, that means that you will have 0 solutions. So just to explain this negative here, you can't have a negative under a square root, so that makes that whole expression undefined. So therefore there's no solutions. And that's kind of where you're going to see on your graph, if you were to graph this, it might be, say, above or below your x-axis, but will never cross that x-axis there. So that's kind of an example where you would have a quadratic formula with 0 solutions. So now we're going to move on to an example from your notes, which is number 2. So here we're going to use the quadratic formula to solve the following, and here we're going to express our answers as exact values, which means that we're not going to be using our calculators to find a decimal for our final answer. So if we have any radicals or square roots in our answer, that means we have to leave it. I know that doesn't make our brain very happy, but if that's what the question wants, that's what it wants. Okay? So here our quadratic equation is 3x squared is equal to 8x minus 3. Now before we can go ahead and use a quadratic formula, we first have to turn this equation into standard form. So that's where all of your variables and numbers are on one side, and either your left or your right side is equal to 0. And to be 100% honest, it doesn't matter if you move everything to the left side, if you move everything to the right side. As long as you do the math correctly, you should get the exact same answer. So just because this makes my brain happier, I'm going to move everything to the right-hand side. So I'm going to move my 8x across by subtracting 8x from each side. I'm also going to move that 3 over, that negative 3 over, and to do that we're going to do an opposite operation, so we're going to add 3 to each side. So what we should be left with here is the 3x squared minus 8x plus 3. And that should be equal to 0 if we did our work right. So 8x minus 8x would cancel that out. Negative 3 plus 3 cancels that out. And all we're left with is 0 on this right-hand side. So now our equation is in standard form, which means we can go ahead and use that quadratic formula to find the roots of this equation. So just to make sure I remember what that quadratic formula is, and that way I become a little bit more familiar with it, I've always liked to rewrite that formula. So according to the quadratic formula, we had x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. So when we go to put in some values into our formula, if it helps, write your a, b, and c in your just below or above your standard form equation. That way you can easily just plop in those numbers, and it kind of takes out some of that guesswork. Also make sure to be in standard form, your values for each of those terms should go in order from highest exponent to lowest exponent. So it should be x squared, then your x term, and then one without a variable. Okay? So now we can move on by substituting these values in for a, b, and c. So we know that b is -8, so we'd have -8 plus or minus the square root of the b value squared, so -8 squared, minus 4 times your a value, times the c value, and then that entire top is divided by 2 times your a value. So from here, you're just going to simplify as much as you can for this. So here we have x is equal to. So we can simplify negative times negative is positive. So we're left with +8 plus or minus the square root. Then we can apply the square and also do our multiplication. So -8 squared is +64, and -4 times 3 is -36. That is all divided by 2 times 3, which is 6. Then we can simplify under our square root symbol. So we have x is equal to 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 36 is 28. And that entire top there is divided by 6. Now up to this point, you might be thinking, awesome, we're done. Isn't this the greatest thing ever? But one thing that we have to do is remember, we need exact values. And one thing in order for it to be exact values and to have a fully simplified answer is that we need to make sure we reduce any fractions if we can, and also need to make sure we simplify the square root symbol. So if this can be rewritten as a product of a perfect square and another number, that means we can simplify that radical. So if you guys want to break down 28, an example of a perfect square times another number would be 4 times 7, because 4 is a perfect square. So I'm just going to rewrite that multiplication. So we have x is equal to 8 plus or minus the square root of 4 times 7, all divided by 6. Because then what we can do is we can apply the square root to that 4 in order to bring that number out. So we'd have x is equal to 8 plus or minus. So in order to move that 4 outside of your radical, you need to apply that square root. So the square root of 4 is 2, and then all you're left with inside the square root is 7. 7 is not a perfect square, so you have to leave it under that square root symbol. And then that whole top is divided by 6. And then we're still not quite done yet. Notice how each of these terms, they all have a number 2 in common. All three of those numbers are even numbers, which means that we can reduce by a factor of 2. So in order to fully answer this question, we need to make sure we have a simplified fraction, which includes both reducing those numbers and keeping your radical simplified as well. So we're going to reduce each of those terms by 2. So what we're essentially just going to do is divide those numbers by 2. So you have 8 divided by 2 is 4, plus or minus. And so 2 square root of 7 divided by 2 is just the square root of 7. That's divided by 6 divided by 2 is 3. Now that our fraction is fully simplified, we cannot reduce by any other numbers, and that radical or our square root symbol is simplified as well. Then what we can do is we can split up our answer using that positive and negative values. So our first solution or root is x is equal to 4 then take the positive value of that square root, then divide it by 3. Your second root or solution is where you have that negative value. So you have 4 minus the square root of 7 divided by 3. So I know that this here might make your brain hurt a lot, and that's okay. Our answer here is fully simplified, and we have an exact value. We haven't rounded, there's no decimals, there's no rounding. I know this hurts our brain, but this here is our final answer. So here you have 4 plus the square root of 7 divided by 3 as one solution, and 4 minus the square root of 7 divided by 3 as your second solution. So this here is an exact answer, and so at this point we're all done. So that is everything here for this video. If you guys have any questions, please come see me in class or text me on Remind 101. And thank you guys so much for watching.